Hello, my name is Dr. David Bray. I'm with the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center as its director, and we're honored today to have two distinguished guests joining us in a lively conversation about what technologies, investments, and policy actions can help us rebuild from COVID-19 on a global scale. This discussion is meant to be interactive, so if you can join us on social media and have questions, or if you're here on Zoom with us, we will take your questions and try to bring them to our distinguished conversation. And we look forward to making this being a proactive conversation, both in terms of what we do in terms of the aspirations to rebuild, as well as the pragmatic steps we need to do with technology, data, and policy. I'd like to first introduce Dr. David Brin. David Brin is an American scientist and author of science fiction. He's received the Hugo, Locust, Campbell, and Nebula Awards. His novel, The Postman, was adapted into a feature film. His nonfiction book, The Transparent Society, has won the Freedom of Speech Award from the American Library Association. And he serves on the advisory boards of NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts Group and frequently does futurist consulting for corporations and government agencies. David, we're honored to have you here and would like to ask you as to what your thoughts are as to what technologies and investments should we be thinking about. What should world leaders be considering as we think about a recovery from COVID-19?
Well, thank you for hosting this. I think it's a fantastic topic, and the Atlantic Council does very good work. And this kind of thoughtful attempts to use our prefrontal lobes, these little nubs above the eyes that are the only organs that we have that no other animal has. These are what let us do what Einstein called the Gedanken experiment, or thought experiment about the future. And this is what we try to do in science fiction, but also you guys try to do in helping planners to look 2, 3, 5, or even 10 years ahead. And the crisis that we're in right now is obviously was exacerbated by a failure to pay attention to people who were pointing 2, 3, 5, or 10 years ahead. And one of the things I'll supply to you to link for people, for viewers down below, is a short story of mine, a piece of fiction from 15 years ago, talking about how viruses negotiate with their hosts. And I think it's terribly important that we are back to thinking about what might happen next. Now, to get to your question, obviously, first off, more science, a better public attitude, a better political attitude toward the possibility of pushing harder on science. But also, very specifically, the thing that slowed down all of our responses was lack of testing. And we're going to have to do a Manhattan Project level ability to be able to take our current skills and automate them very, very swiftly. This whole COVID stay-at-home thing is going to get several industries which have lagged, and one of them is meetingware, which we're using right now and is very primitive, collaborationware for businesses. These have been eking along, moving along very slowly because business managers have been reluctant to let go. Well, one thing that I think will happen as a side shoot to the development of this is managers won't want people to work, a great many people to work at home 100%. You're going to see satellite offices in suburban areas where managers can see people who live in the area and work for them, one at a time, two at a time, three at a time, for an hour or two each day to do their managing thing. And then people will go home and do the work the rest of the day. And this will, I think, be seen by many managers as a sweet spot. And that brings us to local sourcing. Now, this has been predicted for a long time, and it's a trend that's been moving along. But the Earth would benefit, and our cities would benefit, and smog would benefit, and all of that, if a lot of what we consume in our cities was produced in or very near the cities. So this is a trend that's been moving along. And with 3D manufacturing, with additive manufacturing, with natural gas being plentiful, so you can make small factories almost anywhere, you're going to see a lot of local sourcing, and perhaps if we have good leadership, some investments in local sourcing of food right in the urban area. And I'm talking about urban farmings along the south faces of urban buildings where the sun shines. Augmented reality is another area that is going to take off. You're going to start having these glasses that will overlay reality on the world, or the world on reality, well, whatever we're going to redefine as reality. And it goes on. There's certainly lots of things that I believe are going to happen. The most, I think, one thing that I predicted about 3 weeks ago is happening, especially in California, and that's Governor Newsom exempted infrastructure projects from stay at home. So as a result, in this state and several others, workers are plowing ahead at an accelerated pace on subways, metros, even potholes, because these are workers who can be trained to practice decent sanitation. And meanwhile, they can blitz streets that are almost empty. And I think this is very intelligent. And this is a possible way to get things geared up for the only kind of massive expenditure that can get us out of the coming depression. And that is what people have been talking about for 10, 15 years and delaying. And that is massive infrastructure spending, because what this does is it plows money into the working class, which spends it immediately, and you get high money velocity. None of the supply side economics experiments have ever worked, as Adam Smith himself would have predicted, and he did predict, because those investments, those infusions of money lead to lowered money velocity. They always do. And with that, I think that, that was enough blather. There are other things we could get into, but, that's a bunch of things that I expect on the near horizon. And Dr. Newcomer, I think, will probably have some very important things to say about how this is going to change us as a people, as a society, as a political, as a melange of both American and international political entities. And I can't wait to hear her speak.
Excellent. Well, thank you, David. And definitely, it sounds like we have some changes afoot with the future of work, the future of how we interact, and like you said, quite possibly, hopefully, some renewed interest in investing in infrastructure. So with that said, I'd also like to introduce Dr. Kathryn Newcomer. Dr. Kathryn Newcomer is a professor at the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy at George Washington University. She teaches graduate courses, and she focuses on nonprofit evaluation and research design. She's published 6 books. The most recent came out this winter from Brookings, entitled U.S. Inspector Generals, Truth Tellers in Turbulent Times. And she is also a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration. Kathy, we're really glad to have you here. I would ask you sort of a similar question with a focus on policy side. What investments and policy action should we think about in the US as well as globally to help with the COVID-19 recovery?
Thank you very much, David. I'm honored to be included in this conversation. I'm going to have 3 basic themes today that I will come back to, and I think I'll be able to link how technology relates to them. And they are trust building, evidence building, and transparent accountability. I think that one of the things that this is the current crisis has demonstrated is that nothing is going to get accomplished without cross-agency, cross-governmental level, cross-sector within our country, as well as international cooperation. We're not going to be able to do anything without trust building. Another aspect that I think has been highlighted by the huge racial disparities of the people that have been affected by the pandemic are the existing structural racist institutionalized practices. We've had policies that have produced the sorts of racial lines. Currently, I'm working on a book which is called Equity-Based Evidence. And in my first chapter, I had all of these indicators health, education, and wealth, demonstrating the gaps racially in our country. And voila, the pandemic basically is demonstrating how they play in together. My second point about evidence building is something that is not that far off. The Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking in September 2017 offered about 22 recommendations. And one of the things they said, which I think is extremely important, we have to remember, is that basically generating and using evidence for policy is a nonpartisan kind of endeavor. This is not, we don't have to worry about politics in terms of actually doing a better job of generating data. The IT is there. I don't have to think about 5 years out. We could do the things now. The Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Act of 2018 that was signed into law in early 19 had basically legislated about half of the 22 recommendations from the commission's report. And one of the things that has not been done is to develop and fund a national secure data service that would allow for better sharing of data across agencies in a secure manner, to be able to figure out the kinds of impacts this has had. Related to evidence building, I would say that we need to do a good job of after action reviews about what's happened this time. This was done after the Ebola crisis a few years ago, and we need to learn. If we just start developing things without looking to what's been helpful and what hasn't, we're wasting huge opportunities. And my last theme is transparency and accountability. And here is where I think that we really need to think nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. So for example, with the stimulus, you had the recovery and accountability and transparency group, which people called the RAT board, that was made up originally in 2009 of about 14 inspector generals who are nonpartisan, who are not appointed with any kind of political expectation, but are experts in accountability. We also need to have something that, and now with the IT, can even be better than recovery.gov. Back then, recovery.gov provided transparent data about where the money from the stimulus was going and what it was used for. We can do that, but we can even do, 2.0 of tracing the money. And we need nonpartisan experts to lead this effort to get back to my first point, which was to make sure that we are ensuring trust building from the American public about how our governments are reacting to the current crisis. So for example, money goes down, as it did with the Recovery Act. The current act cares the money will be going down through states, local governments, and there is room for not using the money the way it's supposed to be. And that's why we need to have a transparent process. We have fantastic public servants, people like the former commandant of the Coast Guard, Thad Allen, who led the federal response to both Katrina and the BP oil spill. There are people, and more than just that are out there that can present nonpartisan expertise to figure out how we lead our recovery in a transparent, accountable, and trust-building way. So those are my initial thoughts.
Wow. I think we're going to have a lively conversation, and I'm going to jump to David in a real quick moment, but I was going to ask you one additional follow-up, Kathy, because you were talking about evidence-based policy and that we need evidence-based policy, and I enthusiastically support as someone who's a nonpartisan myself. At the same time, I can recall we were having conversations in 2009, 2010 to try and do evidence-based policy, especially when it came to science policy. And for whatever reason, that didn't get momentum. So I guess my question is, how do we convince, because sometimes I think politicals can see that going to evidence-based policy might be taking away some of their control or influence. How do we convince them? Is it that we go to the public directly and say evidence-based policy is good and that you need to actually encourage and elect people that have that? Or how do we solve this gap between those who want evidence-based policy and those that may find it politically inconvenient or possibly taking away some of their control?
Well, as a political scientist speaking here, we're never going to have any policy that is absolutely just simply driven by evidence. There are clearly, it's like talking about performance-based budgeting. Both terms are the holy grail. They aren't going to happen, but the point is to figure out how you do this in a better way. One thing that's different from 2009 to 2020 is that with the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Act, you have a variety of specific legislative measures that have helped at least the federal agencies to do a better job of thinking about how to generate and use evidence in, for example, having the chief evaluation officer, evaluation plan, a learning agenda. And so we have more tools than we did then. I think there's also recognition from some skeptics, such as myself, that you need to actually do a better job of developing leaders and managers so that they actually know how to measure and utilize very relevant, useful, and competent evidence. So we've come a long way, but no, it's something we aspire to.
It's an aspiration, but it's good to have. So
Yeah.
with that, David, Kathy was talking about transparency. Of course, you've written The Transparent Society. Could you give us some thoughts both on transparency and any additional thoughts as a rejoinder to what Kathy just shared?
Oh, I believe that this is an extremely valuable person. One reason is because she's saying things that I absolutely agree with, so I'm biased. The Transparent Society was my attempt 20 years ago, and I've been fighting ever since to get people to understand a phrase that Kathy used several times, and that's transparent accountability, though I use reciprocal accountability, because that is the great invention of our Enlightenment experiment that finally managed to make a Renaissance resist the normal human attractor state of feudalism for more than 2 generations. Periclean Athens did it for about 2 generations. Florence did it for about 2 generations. We've managed for about 10 to have successively, gradually improvement of a deeply imperfect renaissance of freedom and all of those things, and creativity, vastly more productive than any other society, vastly more successful in any metric. But it's not freedom per se. It's not capitalism per se. It's the thing that those things allow, and that is reciprocal accountability, because human beings are delusional. And across 6,000 years of human history, 99% of cultures were ruled by narrow male castes of guys with swords or magic wands, who were able to repress the only antidote to their delusions, and that is criticism. So it's the free flow of criticism that enables us to overcome errors. Take a look at what's happened with facial recognition. I mean, all the hand-wringing of the activists, and by the way, the activists, I'm on their side. Give money to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, ACLU, all that. I love these people, but they often don't look at themselves as a phenomenon. The hand-wringing over facial recognition resulted in quick studies and changes to the face recognition systems in more speed and more real time than anything I've ever seen before. The inherent bias of the algorithms, for example, was pounced upon within months, within weeks after the algorithms were released. That's the key word. The algorithms were released. And so this process was able to take place. Now, I couldn't agree more with Kathy's emphasis on the inspectors general. They are the canaries in the coal mine, and when they start getting fired or bullied, we have a real problem. Now, in my recent book that I self-published because it couldn't come out, my regular publishers wouldn't bring it out in anywhere near good enough time. In polemical judo, I talk about one thing that would really make a difference. Sun Yat-sen, when he established the Chinese Republic, called the inspectorate the fifth branch of government. The fourth is keeping us alive right now, and that is, and Kathy mentioned that too, and that's the civil service. The brilliant and hardworking so-called deep staters.
Yeah, I never was read into that compartment. If a deep state exists, I was never told that it exists.
I don't. It's just 500,000 people all agreeing to the same conspiracy. Yes, this is highly human. But the fifth branch of government that Sun Yat-sen spoke of could be established with security, nonpartisan rather than bipartisan, in the United States with a bill that would take 1 page. And that is to establish a uniformed service of the inspector, just like the public health service is uniformed, and and NOAA. And so that gives them a sense of elan and training and oath keeping under an office called the Inspector General of the United States. Mm-hmm. And they are simply removed from the chain of command of their agencies and report to her, to the Inspector General of the United States. And that could be done in 1 page. And if that, I think, were done, I think it would have tremendous effect. So basically, I'm using my time saying, wow, trust building, facts are biased, and this is why I believe certain forces in our society have made the fact-using professions the bêtes noires of their movement. Mm-hmm. And it is vitally important that the opponents of this putsch should realize that racism, etc., are distractions from. I think this is terribly and politically incorrect for me to say this, and I will get in trouble for saying it. But the people who are hurt the most by what's been going on, who are the poor, racial minorities, genders, they are being hurt the most. But they are not the main targets. Why would the powerful worry about the powerless? Think about it. The powerful's main thrust is to disempower powerful forces that stand in their way. And the powerful forces that stand in the way of this putsch, this mafia putsch, are the civil servants, the scientists, the intelligence agents, the FBI, the military officer corps. These are the fact professions that are actually being derided far more often than other races by the oligarchic media.
Well, so
I hope that's interpreted correctly, because I hope that's interpreted by others as not demeaning the importance of racism in all of this. But
and making sure we're inclusive. And I think what you're saying is we definitely need to be mindful of those that are either because of race or because of wealth status or gender have been not as included in the uplift that was happening even before COVID-19 and need to be included going forward.
They're hurting more.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're all saying that. I think what you're also saying, though, is be mindful that there have been, and I think this is something that maybe we could even share some empirical data on. There is a study that looked at the last 20 years and found there's been a slow erosion in trust in civil servants, and that's across multiple administrations. It's not just one administration, and that, like you said, facts can be cherry picked or they can be presented in the light that anything out of context can be made to look bad. And so I like what you're saying, David, about making sure there's a professionalization in which they are held to standards. And much like how doctors, if something goes wrong, then other doctors review and they say, would I have done the same thing or not? Was this a case of malpractice, or was this just a case of it unfortunately went badly? But Kathy, I'm going to go to you because I know we've talked a little bit about who watches the watchers. So maybe give a real quick thought on that. And then I'd actually like to go to the other question, which is the rural-urban divide. But we'll save that for right after we get to your thoughts first on who watches the watchers in terms of who watches the IGs to make sure they're behaving well too and are being held to the standard that David mentioned.
So before I speak specifically about the Inspector Generals, I want to remind you all that the Government Accountability Office is a very well-respected organization that is more similar to, I think, what the other David was talking about, in that it does respond to Congress, but the GAO has produced many, many, many reports over the years that help to make government policies and management more transparent, to come up with recommendations and so on. And they are not located within an agency like the Inspector Generals are. And their only capital is their reputation for integrity and objectivity. And so you do have the GAO, but it has also been cut in size quite a bit since the mid-90s. And it is a wonderful organization to help us to provide the kind of transparency and good government that we need. So I just want to put in a plug for the GAO. Now, there are now 75, as of last month, Inspector Generals. When they were originally established, it was only the 12 largest organizations in 78, largest agencies. And now we have them all across the government. And the one that became a bit of a controversy most recently in the new CARES Act, the response to the Coronavirus Act. The Democrats on the Hill said we need to have an Inspector General that would look specifically at the implementation of this act. And the point about Inspector Generals is that they, as we all say, they walk a barbed wire fence in terms of being accountable to both the agency heads or the executive branch and the Congress at the same time. And so the notion is that because their two key stakeholders are going to be watching them, they need to make sure that there is nothing that they do that is either perceived as partisan or not objective. And so this is how they are held accountable, in that when something happens that either the Congress or the agency or even the White House thinks is going, crossing the line between, for example, being at all partisan or at all biased, there will be a public response. And so on a sort of day-to-day basis, it's kind of like legal quality and medical quality. When bad things happen, then you see the accountability. Literally, the Inspector Generals, now the 75, don't have performance appraisals like you and I may do, in that there is nobody that is going to be actually giving them specific ongoing appraisal. However, basically the proof is in the pudding in terms of the quantity and quality of the reports and the recommendations and dollars saved for the public is how they are held accountable. And in general, you have wonderful people, again, nonpartisan. Typically, most of them have had government experience, and many of them in actually IG offices, if not the one which they are promoted to be the Inspector General. And you have great continuity. They are the best sources of information about where any weaknesses or lack of controls are in government agencies, to their ability to do their job. So they present a great resource.
Okay, so recognizing that we're here to talk about tech and investments and rebuilding, and we've gone a little bit down the IG side, let's try to transition to the conversation that there used to be an Office of Technology Assessment that doesn't exist anymore. And we know it's hard enough to get technology expertise in the government to begin with. How do we tackle technology, which are hard enough to get experts that want to do technology in government versus someplace else? The odds of finding a technology expert IG might be kind of like trying to find a pink zebra. I guess the question is, are there other ways where maybe we could either have peer review or involve the private sector and the public to be a part of this solution, because I don't necessarily think the future is going to be, and I've had experiences where trying to find someone who's both an expert at being an IG and an expert at technology is very rare. So who wants to go first on that one? Kathy, go ahead.
Yes, actually, I know that it is a common misperception that people that have great IT skills do not want to go into government because they make less. But actually, it is not true. While I'm not saying that every single position is filled, there is actually great expertise in government in terms of, for example, cybersecurity. One of my doctoral students works in the Army and was part of a huge task force that cracked the code for ISIS. And we do have wonderful capabilities within government. There's, when people ask me about like, well, what do you think about performance? I point out that you can't make a comment that applies to all federal government or all government. There are pockets of absolute excellence. And for example, the National Acquisition Service, who knew that they are doing such a great job with data? They are pushing, front edge of utilizing multiple data sources to improve and push forward acquisitions in the federal government. And there are lots of really good examples. So while I'm not saying that every single position is filled, you would be surprised that there are many wonderful public servants who are working on cybersecurity and other aspects of IT right now.
So, and I think, Kathy, not to disagree with you, but I would also say I worked with the Department of Defense that said they can get talent and they train the talent, but after about 3 or 4 years, if you're looking at the salary that the Department of Defense will pay versus a large technology firm, they lose that talent. So they bring them up, they train them, but they can't retain them. So that's something I have seen empirically with the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. And like you said, it's pockets. It's not everywhere. The other challenge, I think, is that we're also facing the challenge that some of these technologies are changing so fast that we may need to look at a new way of organizing, that we actually have government people co-located next to people that are in the private sector and academia that are doing this, that by having people just in a government agency and interacting once every month with the private sector or with the academics that are leading this, it does not keep their skills up to date. Now, again, clearly, Department of Defense, they have a talent pool. NSA clearly retracts cybersecurity talent. But maybe we actually need to look at a new way of organizing to actually move faster compared to, say, countries that might have 1.4 billion people where their private sector is not separated from their public sector. So I just raised that to sort of think about. David, do you have thoughts? I see you have something to say.
Yeah. This is very intriguing, and I agree totally. And I think that it's very important that we recognize our strengths and play to those. For example, during the Cold War, it was clear that we did not have as good spycraft as the KGB. They would run circles around our spies very often, and also they had the advantage that they would send their spies into a 99% open society. We would send ours into a 99% closed society. In theory, we would simply lose.
Right.
But we had something that counterbalanced that all the time, and that was defectors. And if you're as old as I am, you would remember every 5 years or so, there'd be these headlines about this major Soviet official who brought tons of files over, and all of a sudden we were even again. And if you look at the headlines from the last 10 years, you see a systematic destruction of the three things that enabled us to get defectors. This is something I talk about when I go to the CIA every year, and believe it or not, a lot of our agencies bring in hardcore science fiction authors every year to talk about outside the box things. And what we would provide to the defectors was safety, good prospects, and the moral high ground. And you can see how these have been systematically demolished, and the rate of defectors has plummeted as a result. Now, if you take a look at the question of how we develop expertise in and out of government, I think that should take advantage of our strengths, just like we did then. We have an open society, a largely open society. There's a lot of flow back and forth between government agencies and the private sector, some of it corrupt, and that's got to be dealt with. But I think what we need to do is actually get around to figuring out what government's good at and what it's not. And we can base this on the concept of horizons, both the distance in time and where you're talking about being concerned. Government is really, really good when it does develop these prefrontal lobes at looking beyond the 5-year ROI, return on investment horizon of most corporations. Unfortunately, tax laws, et cetera, and many other things have reduced the ROI for most corporations from 5 years down to 1 year and down to the quarterly statement that would let the CEO get his parachute. Government has to, not only do we have to fix that, but government has to be able to provide seed funding that enables immediate problem solving in the short horizon, but also I'm on some NASA commissions that do this. What's beyond the 5-year horizon? No estimable profit, except that there's hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of stuff in the asteroids that we should be investing in going after. So I think one solution is to revamp our whole concept of what the military reserves are. And these people who we train should be subsidized to be members of the reserve of various government agencies. They go out, they get their good employment after we've trained them, and then they are expected to come back for meetings and drills once a month and stay up to date about government needs, and then go back to their employment.
Nice.
And I think it wouldn't take much of a revamp to do that, of the reserve concept. And down below in the box below, there will be a link to some of the work I've been doing on resilience and some of the measures the government should have been doing for the last 20 years to harden us against electromagnetic pulses, which can come from the sun or an enemy, to ensure that our 2 million solar roofs will actually operate in a power blackout, and the vast majority of them will shut down when we need them most. To develop peer-to-peer text passing on these cell phones shut down when we need them most.
Right.
And so folks can look up that link, and I'm sure Kathryn will provide some interesting links as well.
So I really appreciate it. I actually like your idea of what can we learn from how we encourage the defectors during the Cold War, because what we're probably trying to do is encourage talent either to stay and continue with government, even if there may be incentives to go elsewhere, or if they choose to go work in the private sector or academia, bring their talent back in some either reservist way or some way that benefits people. And go ahead, Kathy, yes.
What I was going to say is the mechanism is already there. It's called the IPA, Intergovernmental Personnel Act, and it's been there for as long as I can remember, so a long time. It's just that we haven't used it enough. So there are some organizations that regularly allow their and encourage their top level folks to go and spend 6 months at top organizations, McKinsey or other private sector organizations. This happens now. It just doesn't happen as much as it should, because we have a society that basically hates government and thinks that the least government is the best government. And so we do not fund learning. To be able to fund those kinds of opportunities, you have to recognize that we want to support and actually fund ongoing learning. And the public, as embodied in Congress, has been pretty stingy in thinking that things like, training and development, that's the first thing to go. We don't have enough, for example, travel, so that even the people running federal programs can't even go travel to actually visit grantees and local providers of services. The other thing is that we already have lots of interplay between the public and private sector. But I want to get back to my themes. Is the first one was trust building. And you're right, trust is the lowest it's ever been, not only in our country, but in basically all of Western democracies, by the way. And the trust in government and in pretty much most authorities, including academia, you name it, institutions, is extremely low. That's why I started with trust building. There's one good thing I could say that I would say it could be a result of the current crisis. And that is that maybe people will recognize that we do need to work together, private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, cross boundaries, cross governmental levels, that we need to work together and respect one another's expertise and what we bring to the table. For example, right now, the Gates Foundation, the state of Washington, and University of Washington are talking about what they're going to do now, tomorrow. And that's the kind of wonderful kinds of organizational collaboration that I think we need to inspire and support, incentivize. I'll come back to that when you come to our asking us for outside the box thinking.
Sure. So we've got about 20 minutes left, and I'm going to toss out three possible paths because I recognize there's many themes that have been emerging from this. First, when we were talking about tech and data, we have not talked about automation and robotics. And so I raise that because is that something that can either help us here, or is it going to be a challenge? Because at the very time when we're dealing with increased unemployment and people trying to find jobs, if people start investing in automation and robotics as a response to COVID-19, is that going to create a tension between those that are investing in the automation robots and those that are looking for jobs? That's one. Second, I'm going to toss out for us to consider as well is what do we do about the rural-urban divide? Right now, it is perceived, at least in the United States, and this is also true in other places in the world, that mainly COVID-19 was more problematic in urban areas. But rural areas haven't really seen it as much, partly because of distancing, possibly because of a lag effect. But at the same time, the rural areas are seeing the most job loss, or at least the jobs that won't ever be coming back, versus urban areas will find some way to get back there. And so what do we do about the rural-urban divide, and what type of investments might actually try to solve that as well? And then third, we've been talking about how we can actually bring together the public, the private sector, and academia on a project. And I think, David, you said like a Manhattan-like project. Do we need to think about something that actually tries to bring together people to make sure we don't have another pandemic again? As I think you said, David, that there were people warning about pandemics for the last 2 decades, and that this was just a matter of time when the dice were going to roll and it was going to come up snake eyes. But I raise that because is this something we're now facing where we have had this low probability event, we've seen its impact, maybe now is the time to try and figure out how we make our planet more resilient and actually try to make sure future pandemics are not as bad. So David, if you want to tackle that first, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Those, right? The pandemic thing. Well, what can I say? When this first started, a number of pundits were saying, this has actually got a silver lining to it because it's a drill that will make us never the same in our complacency, with an actual death rate that's pretty low. Now, there are things that frighten me about this version of the SARS virus. As a coronavirus, like the common cold, it has some weird effects upon our immune system where we forget. The flu manages to stay active with us by mutating new versions. Coronaviruses don't mutate as fast as the flu, but they have some weird ability to make our immune systems forget them, so that they can come back, but generally in a milder form, which brings up some of the things that we're really worried about, and that is people getting reinfected or ill again. And what we don't know is how much organic damage even people who were asymptomatic might have suffered inside their bodies. These are all things we're going to be finding out, like we'll be finding out whether or not this was escaped from a lab. So these are all, and if so, should there be draconian international inspections of all such labs? But in order to get that, we need to have a more proactive international attitude, which Kathy talked about, how the morale in the West has been, I believe, deliberately destroyed. When in fact we are more capable than we ever were. So yes, but so yes, this is going to leave us better prepared by far for what could be vastly worse. Because, as these guys say, the actual death rate is pretty low. And young people are being largely left alone unless there's this hidden layer of damage. And that's what scares me, is that we don't know any of that yet. As far as the rural-urban divide, here we get into my crackpot territory.
Okay.
I think
we're going to go to Kathy, so go ahead.
I think one of the major, and this is, I'm wearing my crackpot hat now. I can do that. I'm licensed. I believe a large part of the rural-urban divide is the September trauma, and that is every September for the last 100 years, every small town in America has seen their best and their brightest, the young people of whom they were most proud, run away from town to our bright lights and universities. And I cannot imagine how that can't have been traumatic on a very deep psychic level. And I think it helps explain why our bright lights in cities and universities are viewed as Mordor. If you look across 6,000 years of human mythology, what's one of the most chilling things? The elves come from their bright castles and steal human children. And when these children come back to these small towns, they are changed. They are changelings. Now, that is crackpot stuff. But if you stop and you think about it, I think that's a deep underlying reason. And we have to have empathy for it. But there's nothing we can do about it. Our bright lights, our universities will give us Star Trek.
All right, so Kathy, with that, thoughts and rejoinders that you might have. Thank you, David.
Yes, I do have a couple thoughts, and it gets back to one of my themes, which is evidence building. And that, for example, if we build a strong ecosystem of collecting public health data that supported and we could do this. We could do this in a very user-friendly way to be able to input the data more quickly in real time from across the nation. We could actually use artificial intelligence, AI, to examine the data in a very quick fashion. So the technology is there. What we need is a political will to say that, yes, I get it. We are in a federal system, states' rights and all that. But we have a very inconsistent kind of entering of data from across the country to CDC. We need to fix that. We need to provide, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that people will say, wow, if we could just get those data together and we can use AI to look for the trends, we could have been learning things in February if we had a better system. And I'm not talking about Big Brother. I mean, we should be doing this. For example, I had a doctoral dissertation I directed looking at zoonotic disease reporting in our country, and it varies across the states. Now, on the second point, I'm from Nebraska. Okay, we have a lot of great farming and ranching in Nebraska. And there's a lot of wonderful people that are doing this that help to feed the rest of the nation. And while I understand, David, that there are people that leave the farm, but there are a lot of people that stay. The problem is, though, it is very difficult for individual farms and ranches to survive in an era where you have this consolidation of the mega companies. And our USDA remember the Agricultural Extension Service? That's been around for, 100 years. We have the capacity to figure out how to better support rural areas. This is not something that we have to, design from the get-go. Come on. There are universities, places like Iowa State, Wisconsin, state land grant universities that are receiving money and doing a lot of good work through the Agricultural Extension Service. But first, we have to have the political will. And so I've been talking a lot about nonpartisan initiative, but we need bipartisan initiative. to say we want to do something. We have the actual infrastructure, but we need to do it, whether it's the rural areas. Again, we have the Agricultural Extension Service. We have a USDA that has a lot of really smart people and experts.
Okay.
And,
So sorry to
and I
interrupt.
didn't hear your third question.
So it was just basically putting out. We are 10 minutes left, so it was probably going to have to be a conversation for a later date. But we do have 10 minutes left, and I really appreciate both what you've shared, Kathy and David. At this point, we're now in the tweet size length responses. So if you can keep them fairly short, we have two questions. One is saying we've been focusing very much on the domestic side. Can we lift up to what needs to be done on the international side? So I'm going to give you each 2 tweets max. After that, your word limit's going to come out. But I'll start first with Kathy. You were talking about what could be done in the US, but let's think about what could be done globally. What could be done there? Where could we see some leadership?
That comes back to my trust building. We need to build trust with particularly Canada. Let's start with Canada and Mexico, okay? But clearly, this calls for the kind of crisis that we're dealing with calls for international cooperation. We need to demonstrate we want to come to the table. We want to bring our experts to the table from all sectors.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathy. And David, you get 2 tweet length answers thinking about what could be done. There's someone that says we've been talking about pandemics, but like you said, we need to start thinking about solar EMP, major earthquake, climate change. What can we do technology-wise and infrastructure-wise to be prepared for not just this specific quote unquote black swan event, but other black swan events as well?
Well, one healthy response is to develop, as I said, more dispersed. This is a very American Canadian instinct, and it's a very good one, and that is more dispersed local sourcing, more reliability amongst. This is our tradition, but it must not go to the opposite extreme that I talk about in my novel, The Postman, where you get the doomsday preppers. And the most scary of the doomsday preppers are the uber rich who are doing this. I know a bunch of these guys. And you cannot buy a mountain in Patagonia anymore. The prices have gone out the roof. And I'm talking, near Tierra del Fuego. These guys are buying up whole mountain ranges and seabed and ranchitas in South Island, New Zealand, and they just basically need a spanking. Just come on back. You get to stay rich, but invest it in us. We're going to be taxing those, and in order to tax the ranchitas in Patagonia, we need to have an international order and make treaties in that regard. Now, you see, I segue between practical suggestions and crackpot observations because to me they're all one melange, one spectrum.
One spectrum. It's all visible light.
yeah, no line between them.
Well, I appreciate that. So we now have about 7 minutes, and I'm actually interested in everything we've been talking about. We talked about how we used to be able to do things and we used to be able to do things. And the question that people have been asking is, where's the leadership now? And one thing I want to toss out, and again, looking for about 2 or 3 tweet size lengths responses, is are we in an era in which, in one hand, we're now more connected now than ever, and that an increasing number of the population has either a cell phone or a smartphone. And yet, from my own experiences with the bioterrorism program, we had tons of misinformation around 9/11. We had misinformation around anthrax. We had around SARS. But people didn't have smartphones to add to the noise. And so while misinformation theories existed and some were circulating on the internet, it was still not it couldn't go as viral as it could now. And at the same time, we have had in a history in this country, at least, where we had yellow journalism in the 1890s. And that's when newspapers did not have subscriptions. And so they had to sell their papers on a daily basis. So are we in an era in which we are facing the challenge of which you're now super connected now more than ever? But we have apps that may be designed to get you neurologically hijacked to play into your confirmation bias. And same thing with newspapers is they've discovered that well-researched, nuanced articles get 1/10 the ad clicks as something that's one-sided. So recognizing you each have about 2 or 3 tweets, I'll go first to Kathy for the closing thoughts about how do we solve this misinformation, disinformation, and see true leadership on all the topics we've been discussing today.
Well, one of the things that I think has been very prominent in the current situation is literally the local television stations have been doing a great job of virtually all of them have these sort of fact finders, ask the question, verify, they call it, let's verify, whatever. I think that there is a response really coming from the local level to say, we want to verify these facts. And you do have shows, for example, Trevor Noah on The Daily Show reaches probably more people ages 18 to 30 than anybody in the country. And I watch every day. He is doing a great job of verifying, and we're using humor, of course. But I think that again, the silver lining is that I think that the phrase "we're all in this together," and you have that repeated by movie stars, politicians, whatever. I'm hoping that this might introduce this new era of saying we do want to verify. We need the facts. We need the evidence to inform nonpartisan initiatives.
Thank you,
Well,
Kathy. David, you get the closing thoughts. What can we do to help try to solve the fact that there's a fragmentation of both a national and global narrative?
Well, first off, we need to get past this notion that communitarianism and cooperation and competition are somehow opposites. When the founder of our whole movement, Adam Smith, and the American founders understood that we need to cooperate in order to engender the competitive, the joyful, flat, fair competition that is the most creative force in the universe that made us. And I talk about this in polemical judo, but the main point is that facts and respect for argument are absolutely vital in order to do this. And we need to have perspective on what communication technologies, absolutely perfect question, David, have done for the last 500 years. When the printing press was invented, wasn't all Gutenberg Bibles.
No, it wasn't.
What happened was, what the principal output of printing presses for the first 50 years were horrible religious tracts, slandering Protestants and Catholics and exacerbating the horrible religious wars. What happened was, over time, the optimists proved right, and this new medium did elevate humanity. But there was a period of time in which people were susceptible to the manipulations. And this happened again when the printing presses became newspapers. And this happened again in the most lethal of them all when radios and loudspeakers arrived in the 1930s and gifted Savonarola's manipulators. This amplified the human voice to godlike proportions. They took over all over the world. And the biggest difference in the English-speaking world was that the gifted orators who became empowered by radios and loudspeakers in the English-speaking world were on our side. And I like to think that's because we chose them, but it could have just been a lucky break.
Right.
In any event, what we're experiencing right now is a series of these waves, a series, one after another, hitting so fast that we don't have time for the normal inoculation effects to make the public secure against the lies. And so it's going to have to be more systematic. It's going to have to be more led. And we need leadership to say, calm down, argue based on facts. And what I talk about in polemical judo is a weapon, and that is wagers. I think some billionaires out there need to step up and challenge Rupert Murdoch and Vladimir Putin and a bunch of other people, and some on the left as well, to flat out put their money on the lies. I think they'll back off.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has clearly been a full spectrum of ideas, from the practical to the aspirational and the idealist. I want to thank
And crackpot.
Oh, crackpot if you want. All right. You have the honorary. So thank you, David Brin, Dr. David Brin. Thank you, Kathryn Newcomer, for everything you're doing as positive change agents. This has clearly been a illuminating and inspirational talk about what we need to do to be more transparent, to build that trust, recognizing that there have been complicating factors on that trust, to think both domestically and ideally globally, and everything at the local level in terms of how we can rebuild from COVID-19. I want to thank you both very much, and truly appreciate you joining us for this conversation.
Thank you very much, David.
Oh, Kathryn, you're a delight, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much.